Evening, everyone. It's really a joy to welcome you to this gathering this evening. My name's Matt Robbins Gormley. I serve as pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Tacoma, and this is the first of a series of workshops on Native American justice. And we're just really glad to have each one of you joining us. This series of workshops is going to be continuing on the fourth Tuesday like this each month here for the next 4 months. Today and then February, March, and we're hoping to watch a wonderful documentary on the fourth one in April. So I hope you put those on your calendar. Tonight's workshop is on the dismantling of the Doctrine of Discovery and Land Acknowledgement. That's our topic tonight. Actually, next time we'll be looking at the painful legacy of Indian boarding schools. And this is a workshop that comes out of years long, in fact, over a dozen years. There's been a series of Tacoma congregations that have engaged in what we've called conversations around race. In fact, from my, it was a little bit before me, but I think that name actually came out of when President Obama said, we need to have a conversation around race in America. And some people from these congregations got together and said, we do. And let's start with the faith community. And so we've been doing that for a long time, a way to focus on deepening our understanding and taking action on the individual level, deepening our own understanding, and then as a community, to really repent of the sins of racism and to find new pathways forward together. We've done that through a lot of different things, through events. We've had theater presentations, doing this through the lens of the arts, with conversations afterwards. And we've had pulpit exchanges between the congregations and workshops like this. Currently in the partnership are Trinity Presbyterian, Peace Lutheran Church in the Hilltop, our neighbors in the Hilltop, the Tacoma Friends community, and then Church of the Indian Fellowship. And really a thank you and a shout out to Ted Johnstone, who has served as our chair for many years and is here this evening. I think I saw his name come across but we're grateful to him. A special thanks to Associated Ministries too tonight, for getting the word out and helping to host this. Thanks, Sandy, for your help in pulling this together as well, Sandy Windley. We're really grateful to bring this to a larger, kind of wider circle of folks than just our congregations. So a couple of housekeeping items as we're getting started, just to make you aware of. Most of us now are very familiar with Zoom. In this new world we're in. Just a couple things. Just one, you saw it on the way in, but we are recording this, so just to be aware of that. And we'll make that recording available to those who weren't able to be here tonight. If you're having trouble hearing at all, we really encourage you to turn up the volume on your end, because you can do that on your side, on your computer or your iPad or whatever. So encourage you to do that. And then also just know that if you don't want the Brady Bunch screen, you can also, when Irvin's doing his presentation, you can put it on presenter view. It's one of the options on how to do the view. And then you'll just get to see Irvin and his slides and things. So also we're going to utilize the breakout group function a little bit later and have a chance to talk together about what we've heard and wrestle with it. So grateful for that as well. So without further ado, let me take a moment just to introduce a friend and a colleague, Reverend Irvin Porter. Irvin is an ordained Presbyterian Church USA pastor. He has been leading the Church of the Indian Fellowship in Puyallup for over 20 years now, which is amazing. In the long history of that congregation that was actually founded in the 1870s as a Presbyterian mission to the Puyallup people, Irvin is the first non-white Native person to serve as pastor of that congregation, and he's done so with just a wonderful grace and wonderful leadership. Irvin comes actually from a long line of Presbyterian clergy and elders in his family, and we're actually going to get to hear a little bit of his personal story tonight as part of the presentation in the workshop. And then for the last 8 years, Irvin has taken a significant role in our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, serving as the Associate for Native American Intercultural Support, which means that the 95 congregations in the Presbyterian Church USA that are primarily Native, he is the person that's reaching out and touching base and connecting with those, as well as just being an important voice at the table for Native American issues at the denominational level. Irvin's married to the Reverend Ann Cecile Porter, who also is an ordained Presbyterian pastor, minister, and she currently serves as a chaplain at Multicare here in Pierce County. Irvin, we're really grateful for you to bring and present. We have lots to learn here tonight, and we're really grateful to have you as our teacher. And so we, without any further ado, I'll pass things off to you with great gratitude for your bringing it tonight.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to speak as loud as I can here, and knowing that some of you might have issues with the volume of my speaking. So I'm going to do my best to do that this evening. Welcoming all of you to this, thanking you for taking the time to be with us this evening. And I look forward also, as Matt has said, to the other workshops that we're going to have in the next 3 months. My wife and I are going to France. We're going to try. We haven't been able to go since 2019, where she's from, in the latter part of April, first part of May. And so we're hoping to have the final workshop, which is a screening of a documentary called Dawnland about Native American issues, sometime in late May. So we're working on the date for that. Obviously, a lot depends on if we're going to be able to travel or not. So that's why that date is still yet to be determined. So I thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and put us on the screen sharing for my PowerPoint presentation. So you might not be able to see my smiling face as we get going here. We begin this evening by acknowledging with humility that the land where I'm speaking to you from today is the traditional territory of the Puyallup people. The Puyallup, which means generous and welcoming people, are a Coast Salish tribe. They were forcibly relocated onto a reservation lands in Tacoma in late 1854 after signing the Treaty of Medicine Creek. Today, they have an enrolled population of 4,000, of whom 2,500 live on the reservation. Again, as Matt introduced me, my name is Irvin Porter. I am an associate for Native American Intercultural Congregational Support for the Presbyterian Church USA. I descended from 3 tribes, the Pima, the Tohono O'odham, and the Nespers Tribes. I am enrolled along with my siblings in the Pima Tribe, which is just south of Phoenix, Arizona, where we were raised in Phoenix. So we were not raised on the reservation like many Native people are. And I moved to Idaho, was born in Idaho, but I eventually moved back to Idaho in about 1983, began to work in banking. And by 1993, I was manager of an office in Boise, Idaho, when I felt God's calling in my life to become a minister. So I left that and began to prepare to go to seminary. I ended up in Iowa, and after getting my bachelor's degree, was able to finish my my master's in divinity. And my first call was to the Tacoma Indian Church of the Indian Fellowship in Tacoma. And so I've been the pastor there since 2001, as Matt has said. And then I'm a quarter time there now, and 3/4 time I work as staff for the National Presbyterian Church. This information here, as you see, is the work that this office does to develop leadership in Native American congregations, assist in evangelism and church growth, help to be a voice to Native American Presbyterians in the PCUSA, which is the acronym for the denomination, and beyond. In partnership with mid-councils, which is our presbyteries and synods, other Presbyterian Mission Agency office and other groups, connect, encourage, and help Native American congregations to develop and empower Native American leaders in local church, presbytery, and denominational levels. Make presentations about General Assembly actions taken in support of Native American ministries. And so a lot of what you're going to hear this evening is on this list of goals, assignments, whatever you want to call them. There are 97 Native American congregations in the Presbyterian Church USA today. Most of these congregations do not have ordained or commissioned leadership. Many of the missions begun by the Presbyterian Church did not survive into the 20th century. The largest concentration of these churches that remain are on the Dakota, the Choctaw, the Pima, Navajo, and Nespers reservations, as well as among Native Alaskan villages. This map will show you, it's crudely done, it's low tech, I did it myself, where those areas are today, where we have at least 12 congregations in some places, 26 in Dakota Presbytery, which you see covers North and South Dakota and Eastern Montana. We have had 6 in the Nespers Reservation, but now only have 4. The Navajo Reservation, there are 12 congregations, and among the Gila River, there are 10. Among the Choctaw, there are about 25. On the lower left, I had to add the state of Alaska, was not on this particular map. There are 10 Native American Presbyterian churches scattered throughout the Alaskan villages. And as you see, most of those are on the North Slope. The advocacy strategies that we use with Indigenous people's issues come to us from the General Assembly. There's a lot that I do from my office, but the General Assembly is the legislative arm, as it were, of the denomination, and that is where a lot of this list here comes from. These are actions that General Assembly has taken since 2016. There have been others before this, but they were not as numerous in so few years as this particular list is. And it began in 2016 with the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. Also in 16 was the apology to Native American, Native Alaskans, and Hawaiians for their part in the boarding schools. the Presbyterians ran 30 of these schools. An expanded recommendation on the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. More information was given to the Assembly at that point. And then the Doctrine of Discovery report, which you'll hear me talk about more, is a comprehensive document about the past, the present, and the future of the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was written by Native American scholars, pastors, and leadership. The others are an inventory of our historical churches within the Presbyterian Church in 2018, a report from the newly created Native American Coordinating Council with recommendations, and also in 2020, a report back on the assessment on the Native American church properties. In 1999, I added this one at the bottom. There is a document entitled Negative Effects of Stereotyping Native Americans, and that is basically concerning the mascot issue. A big item that the General Assembly has taken up and approved, and which Native Americans brought to the fore, was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The goal of that declaration was to encourage countries to work alongside Indigenous peoples to solve global issues such as development, multicultural democracy, and decentralization. On September 13th, 2007, the UN voted 144 in favor, 4 against, and 11 nations abstaining to approve that declaration. The 4 nations who voted against the declaration are represented on this slide: New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the United States. The United Nations has stated in the Assembly, has stated in 2020 their continuing support for this declaration supporting Indigenous people. Though not included in your handout links today, I urge you to look for this document and to read it and to understand a little bit more about the struggles of Indigenous people worldwide and what the UN is trying to do to help we, the people, and be, so that we can be all that our declaration states: all men are created equal with unalienable rights to liberty, justice, and the pursuit of happiness. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was finally adopted by the other 4 nations who voted against it. The United States finally did agree to the document with some conditions in the Obama administration. Now binding the resolution which sets and defines the individual and the collective rights of Indigenous people, including their ownership rights to cultural and ceremonial expressions, identity, language, employment, health, education, and other. It prohibits discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and it promotes their full and effective participation that concern them and their right to remain distinct and to pursue their own visions of economic and social development. The goal of the declaration is to encourage countries to work alongside Indigenous peoples to solve global issues like development, multicultural democracy, and decentralization. The Doctrine of Discovery and its continuing impact on Indigenous people. So what is the Doctrine of Discovery? The Doctrine of Discovery is a concept of public international law. It was developed by the United States Supreme Court in a series of decisions. Initially, Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. It is based, the idea, the doctrine, on a 15th century papal bulls, papal decisions that gave Christian explorers the right to claim title to the lands that they, quote, discovered, unquote, and lay claim to those lands for their Christian monarchs. Any land that was not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited. If the pagan inhabitants could be converted, they might be spared. If not, they could be enslaved or killed. By this, we have a quote here from an Onondaga Nation faithkeeper by the name of Orrin Lyons about this. He says, by directive, by fiat, the European nations claim for themselves the entire Western Hemisphere. It is a demonstration of incredible arrogance of the time. This has resulted in the subjugation, genocide, regulating indigenous peoples to a subhuman status in international politics. Indigenous peoples have been laboring and suffering under that status up until the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was established in 2007, which for the first time recognized Indigenous people as peoples. Up until recently, we were politically denied human rights. The Doctrine of Discovery and its continuing impact by legitimizing the widespread mining of natural resources without provision for their renewal that displace and destroy many indigenous people and other vulnerable communities besides harming the ecosystem. Congress has the legal right to sell reservation lands as they see fit. The trust clause ensures this authority. These images are not just for the nightly news program. They are real people fighting real wars against takeover of their lands, not just here in the United States, but around the world. The Native American fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline being placed on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation and beneath the Missouri River waters in North Dakota was one such fight. In July 2021, federal regulators say that they would fine the operators of the Dakota Access Pipeline $93,200 over pipeline safety violations. In June of 2021, a federal judge dismissed the lawsuit filed by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, challenging the operation of the Dakota Access Pipeline. With that ruling, the U.S. District Judge outlined a path for a future legal challenge to an ongoing environmental review, should the tribe seek to make one. Native American people have a saying: the Creator gave us 2 ears, 1 mouth for a reason. But it appears that the wallet, the bank accounts, mean more than words on a treaty. Treaty matters, not only in American Indians, but to everyone who lives in the United States. The United States acquired much of its land through treaties with Indian tribes. Often, these legal documents were not understood by Native people, being forced to sign them or face starvation or worse. The legalese of the empires of Europe were employed to legally force Native Americans off their territory in exchange for very, very little. In the 20th century, many of these worthless reservation lands, as they were deemed, were forced upon, that the Native people were forced upon, yielded oil, water, and other valuable resources. The Pima Tribe, of which I am an enrolled member, after decades of campaigning, won back the water that was the lifeblood of their society in the Arizona Water Settlements Act of 2004. The Pima Tribe, the reservation is located between Phoenix and Tucson. The tribe now owns more rights to Colorado River water and other water. than municipalities in the Phoenix area. They have they have to now negotiate water with the tribes who can now be at that bargaining table and who cannot possibly use all of that water. The tribe's indigenous name is Akamilatam, which means people of the river. The river that flowed through the tribe's territory and fed their complex irrigation systems was diverted by settlers in the late 19th century. Poverty, starvation followed, and many Pima were forced to depend on government rations. These rations were based on three main products: white flour, lard, and sugar. The collapse of the Pima's sophisticated farming system, dependence on rations, and spiraling poverty led to a health disaster. The tribe now has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. More than half of the population over the age of 35 has type 2 diabetes, including me. But now, following the largest water rights settlement ever in Indian country, water is flowing back into Pima territory. With it comes hope. Community farms are being established and school children are getting involved. These negotiated bilateral agreements are therefore fundamental to understanding how the United States was created and how its citizens obtained the land and natural resources they enjoy today. Treaties rest at the heart of both Native history and contemporary tribal life and identity. Approximately 368 treaties were negotiated and signed by U.S. commissioners and tribal leaders and subsequently approved by the U.S. Senate from 1777 to 1868. They protect promises our government made to Indian nations. They recognize tribes as nations, a fact that distinguishes tribal citizens from other Americans and supports contemporary Native assertion of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. All those treaties have been broken. Treaties to which the United States is a party also have the force of federal legislation, forming part of what the Constitution calls the supreme law of the land. The document on this slide is an example of what one church decided that they must do as a first step in reconciliation with Native American peoples, but they say it best. Earth Care Committee of the Church of Reconciliation, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Honoring First People in the Land. The Church of Reconciliation Earth Care Committee 2018 study of the Doctrine of Discovery prompts us to recognize the indigenous peoples who came before us on the lands we now inhabit in North Carolina. The Doctrine of Discovery is a philosophical and legal framework dating back to the 15th century European papal decrees. This framework gave Christian governments a false moral rationale for invading and seizing indigenous land and people around the world. Its effects, including intergenerational trauma, still linger in our social and legal systems. We confess our complicity in this sinful doctrine, and we are grateful that the Presbyterian Church USA, by official apologies to indigenous peoples harmed by colonization, has led the way to listening and to repentance. With the whole church, we intend to further nurture mutual relationships of loving care and respect. We acknowledge that we live on land traditionally belonging to and cared for by indigenous people, now formally recognized as the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, the Cohire Intra-Tribal Council Incorporated, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, Kalaewa Saponi Indian Tribe, Saponi, Lummi Tribe, Waccamaw Siouan Tribe, and the Meherrin Nation. They are our neighbors, those we are commanded to love as ourselves, as we heed Christ's call to the healing of people, of land, and all creation. The doctrine of discovery is, as you can see, widely being studied now, thanks to workshops such as these and other church-led studies about what the doctrine of discovery is. In 2016, the Presbyterian Church received an overture of what we call the legislation being, how do I explain it? Being proposed by a Presbyterian, in this case by National Capital Presbytery in Washington, D.C. And it asked for a 2-year study of the doctrine of discovery within the church. Instead, the assembly added this to another action and called for the reparation of the doctrine of discovery, including the repudiation of such. And so in the 222nd General Assembly, which met in 2016, the church called the Presbyterian Church USA to confess its complicity and repudiate the doctrine of discovery and direct the Presbyterian Mission Agency and the Office of the General Assembly in consultation with what is now our Racial Equity and Advocacy Committee to initiate a process of review of the doctrine of discovery, to prepare a report that describes the doctrine of discovery and explains its history. It makes recommendations on how congregations within the church can support Native Americans in their ongoing efforts for sovereignty and fundamental human rights. Describes how relationships with specific Native American individuals and tribes can be developed. Suggests specific ways in which congregations may recognize, support, and cooperate with Native American individuals and nations who reside within their communities and engage in dialogue with ecumenical partners concerning the doctrine. In recommendation of this document, recommendation number 7 of this document, it calls for the Presbyterian Church to confess that complicity and to direct the Office of the General Assembly, specifically empowering the General Assembly Committee on Representation and Presbyterian Historical Society to lead the church to study and to learn more about the historic and current social, missional, and theological implications of the doctrine of discovery, and also to engage in dialogue with ecumenical partners concerning the doctrine. And this is what happened from all of those suggestions, all of those directives. The work was begun by a committee of Native American leaders to write a report and submit it to the 2018 General Assembly in Baltimore, Maryland. It is a 26-page document, and we have added it to the resource page of this workshop. But I would urge each of you to read the entire document because it explains how the doctrine of discovery got its start and is now the basis for all laws that deal with Native Americans. It also includes stories about how this doctrine has affected Native communities today. This slide shows how much of this work has already begun and includes the formation and the work of the Native American Coordinating Council, which met in Minneapolis and prepared this report in 2020. The report on the doctrine of discovery was prepared by Native American leaders and submitted to the National Church and approved in 2018. Pictures show the work with congregations, committees of the church, and staff development day in 2018, where the Louisville staff were required to attend what's called the blanket exercise as part of the anti-racism training. The group we have tonight, which is well over 100 people on this workshop tonight, is only second to that group. So this is the second largest group I've ever worked with on this, explaining and giving information about the doctrine of discovery. The report, again, highlighted, urging the session or the boards of each of our churches, as well as each mid-council, presbyteries, synods, Committee on Theological Education seminaries, Presbyterian women's groups, and other organizations to confess their complicity and repudiate the doctrine of discovery. Number 8 was to encourage mid-councils to begin their meetings with an acknowledgement of whose land they're meeting on, and that greetings to the assembly include a welcome from those indigenous peoples currently living upon the land. Number 17 of that document is to urge the session or the boards of each congregation, as well as each mid-council, presbytery, or synod, Committee on Theological Education members, seminaries, Presbyterian women's groups, and national church agencies to review their existing study resources on the doctrine of discovery, using that link there, and to lift up histories of indigenous people and current issues facing indigenous people. The items that we've listed, the recent discovery of Native American children's graves at former boarding schools in Canada, made the news in both Canada and the United States last year. Native people have known about graves for generations, though their location, and more importantly, the names of those buried there are not yet known. These children died of many things, including starvation, malnutrition, disease, injuries from abuse, including sexual and brutalization of all kinds. These are not suppositions from Native American people. These are known and often documented situations that survivors of these schools have attested to. My office is now preparing a web page to be linked to the web page for all of our offices to give more information about the realities of the boarding school era of Native American history. Many Americans do not know about this chapter in the life of their Native American brothers and sisters. Many who survived these schools were never the same, were forever changed, and current generations of their descendants continue to deal with the efforts of this experiment at assimilation. Boarding schools, 19th to mid-20th century, more than 100,000 Native children suffered the direct consequences of the federal government's policy of forced assimilation by means of Indian boarding schools during the 19th and 20th centuries. They attempted to replace tribal values, languages, and ways of knowing with dominant white Christian values, religion, culture, and language. Families and entire communities also suffered. As adults, when the former boarding school students had their children, they suffered as well. Now, through painful testimony and scientific research, we know how trauma can be passed from one generation to another. The multi-generational trauma of boarding schools experience is an open wound in all Native communities today. The Native American National Boarding School Healing Coalition, of which I am a member, says that the healing can occur. The full truth about the boarding schools and the policy of forced assimilation must come to light in our country. The first step in a truth, reconciliation, and healing process is truth-telling. A significant piece of the truth about the boarding schools is held by Christian churches that collaborated with the federal government policy of forced assimilation. These pictures of one of the top left there picture is of students at the very first Indian boarding school called Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Most children came from the West, and so they had to travel hundreds of miles on trains sometimes in wagons, to get to those schools far from their communities, and they did not know why. The picture on the bottom of that, below that, is the Tucson Training School in Tucson, Arizona. That is the school that my father and his siblings all attended as children. The pictures on the left are of students from those schools. The one on the bottom left is an Apache student when he arrived at the school, and then another picture which was taken of him just a few months later. The timeline of U.S. Indian policy, layers of historical trauma. There are 6 phases of historical unresolved grief. Traumatic events inflict a wound on the soul that lasts through generations, also known as soul wound. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has provided the information that I'm using in this presentation concerning the boarding school experiment in the United States. Their mission statement says, of the Boarding School Healing Coalition statement says, to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. They started their work in 2012, this coalition. They were formed after a national symposium in 2011. Leaders from the US and Canada came together to discuss the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the need for such a process in the United States. It was created to develop and implement a national strategy that increases public awareness and cultivates healing for the profoundly traumatic experiences by individuals, families, communities, American Indian and Alaska Native nations, resulting in the U.S. adoption and implementation of the boarding school policy of 1869. Boarding school generations. The first generation occurred during the post-Civil War era through World War I. And it ended at the end, it came about at the end of the so-called Indian Wars. There were military-style schools where uniforms had to be worn and hair was cut, both male and female. This was forced assimilation with the prohibition of Native American languages and cultures. Parents of children as young as 4 or 5 years of age were coerced into sending their children to boarding schools to help, quote, civilize, unquote, them. Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, opened in 1879 as the first government-run boarding school for Native American children. The goal, forced assimilation of Native children into white American society with the belief of kill the Indian and save the man. It was during this first generation era that severe corporal punishment was the norm. Many children could not speak English, so when they spoke in their own language, they were beaten, slapped, or imprisoned in cellars, sometimes handcuffed. There's a pair of these handcuffs for children at a museum in Lawrence, Kansas. In the third generation and beyond, this punishment lessened as children came to understand what was expected of them, and many more could speak English. The federal government sponsored 3 separate forms of education for Native Americans from 1879 to 1930. These included industrial vocational boarding schools located outside of reservations, vocational boarding schools located on reservations, and day schools on reservations that stress academic curriculum. Mission schools were a 4th but separate type of school for Indians. In these benevolent institutions, teachers sought to introduce a few Native Americans into church training. Although each of these types of schooling differed from each other, They shared the same aim of leading Native American students to assimilate into the mainstream of American society. Again, the Presbyterian Church ran 30 such mission schools. Again, my father attended one of them, called the Tucson Indian Industrial School. Oops. The second generation of the boarding schools was about the Great Depression era through World War II. Students became bilingual. Boarding schools became an escape route from poverty. Natives get the right to vote in 1924. Natives enlist voluntarily in World War II due to military influence of the first generation boarding schools. The third generation, post-war era through the civil rights era, boarding schools were scaled back in favor of public schools. Students faced racism and discrimination for their mixed heritage. Boarding schools include vocational training. Boarding schools turned over at that point to tribal nations through the Bureau of Indian Education. And the fourth generation is the post-civil rights era to the present day. 73 schools began under historical boarding school era are still in operation today. Native language and culture is often promoted instead of prohibited. And legacies of historical boarding school eras still impact many communities today. The result of these boarding schools and mission indoctrination of Native communities by the federal government was a short-sighted, discriminatory, misguided attempt to make Native people white Americans in all but color, but without the civil rights. You need to also remember that Presbyterians were not the only ones who created these schools and took part in this experiment. There's plenty of blame to go around the Christian church. Again, what some meant for ill, God has used for his good. These and many other churches were formed and built during this era. The first Indian Presbyterian Church of Kamiah, Idaho is on the Nespers Indian Reservation and was founded in 1871. This is where my mother's ancestors have worshiped since, the church from which I entered also into the ministry. Cook Memorial Presbyterian Church on the Pima Reservation south of Phoenix, Arizona, was begun by a German-American missionary. Second Indian Presbyterian Church on the Nespers Indian Reservation in Idaho. Tutuwila Presbyterian Church on the Umatilla Reservation in northeastern Oregon. The Shinnecock Presbyterian Church in Southampton, New York, is our oldest Native American congregation, begun in 1741 by Presbyterian Church missionaries, and the Kayenta Presbyterian Church on the Navajo Reservation. How can our presbytery, our churches, and our denominations bridge the divide? And not just Presbyterians, how can Christians and all kinds of churches around our country? What ways can inroads to reconciliation be made with Native American people on this continent? Turtle Island, as some tribes refer to the earth. Trust. This is very important within Native American communities, both Christian and tribal. It must be developed, and it can take many years to accomplish. But once trust is established, it is the foundation of any relationship with Native people and can be built upon. Without it, there's no relationship. If broken, same difference. Meet Native American people where they are. Don't expect them to come to you to your church or to your meetings. That is a colonist dominant society way of conducting what is supposed to be a two-way relationship. Maybe the Native person may want to meet on neutral territory, a coffee shop, Starbucks, or even a restaurant. This isn't unusual. Go with it. Allow that first gathering to be carefree, relationship building. Don't worry about agendas, just be yourself. And listen. Listen to what your brothers and sisters have to say. We are people of deep religious faith, whether that is Christianity or Native American religions. This slide represents a cross-section of today's Native American Presbyterian community, and it can also then be said for all Native American Christians in our country. Youth continue to be part of our Native American Youth Conference, which we hold every 3 years until COVID. Our American Indian Youth Council leads those efforts. Churches continue with annual revival services or evangelistic services, as they're called in other reservations, and camp meetings, which have been held annually, sometimes over 100 years now. We are a resilient people. We adapt to changing situations, changing American culture, and yes, even the silence of our brothers and sisters in denominations which we are supposed to be part of. That 92%, which is white. But Native people have had over 500 years of adapting to white culture. Native American Presbyterians may be one of the poorest constituencies within the church. Our churches may be falling apart because we don't have the funds to fix them. We may be losing membership too, but our faith is strong. We love our God, and his vision for our people remains. Despite the past, despite the present situation we find ourselves in. God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. It's been estimated that only about 4% of Native Americans are Christians. Many of us inherited a legacy of Christian faith from our ancestors who were early converts to the faith of Jesus Christ. But some Native American Christians are seen as sellouts to a white man's religion. We are accused by some of our tribal people as being disrespectful to our cultures and the sacrifices that many Native people made against U.S. manifest destiny in the 1800s and even earlier in colonial domination. But again, we adapt. The sense of call to the ministry of Jesus Christ was answered and lived by these members of my ancestors since 1860. This slide shows my faith genealogy. Both sides of my family have been Presbyterians and some of the first converts to Christianity after missionaries arrived among their people. The Pima in southern Arizona and the Nespers in north central Idaho. Our family name, Porter, we are the third generation to have this last name. It was an indigenous name prior to that, and the name Porter was adopted from one of the school teachers on the Pima Reservation. My mother's people, the Nespers, first encountered Christianity among Lewis and Clark's expedition in the 1805, when our ancestor Twisted Hair met with them in what is now Idaho. After men sent to missionary schools in what is now Ontario, Canada, the Nespers went east seeking teachers of technology and the white man's religion, though they did have their own, and they still do. 4 men were sent to look for Lewis and Clark in 1831 and ended up in St. Louis, Missouri, where they were able to find William Clark, but they could not speak to each other for they did not understand each other's language. 2 men died there, including one of those who was my ancestor, named Speaking Eagle. This led to missionary work among the Nespers and other tribes in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1830s, followed by settlement and settlers seeking land. So my ancestors, predecessors in ministry include Archie Lawyer, son of Twisted Hair, ordained in 1881, my third great-grand uncle. Harry Moffat, ordained in 1925, my great-grandfather. Walter Moffat, ordained in 1955. In 1979, until his retirement, he served as a minister in the United Methodist Church. He is the son of Harry Moffat and my great uncle. Lawrence Porter, ordained in 1950. My father, Pima, his father was a lay pastor on the Pima reservation and received theological education from the first missionary among the Pimas. Cecil Corbett, ordained about 1961, my fourth cousin. Cecil bears the last name Corbett, which is the family name of my maternal great-grandmother. And Barry Moffat, ordained as a United Methodist minister in 2000, my second cousin, son of Walter Moffat and grandson of Harry Moffat. This presentation has tried to bring information to you which not only informs you, but also helps you to understand the story of your Native American brothers and sisters better. And for some, it may be the first step in your understanding the complex issues that have engulfed my people's complex history. Native people do not want your sympathy. We want you to help us to understand this complex history and to help us all move beyond it, to move into reconciliation that is a partnership with each other and not just a relationship whereby Native people are the receivers. A relationship which helps both sides to grow in greater understanding of each other. You are not responsible for these events in my people's history. You didn't create these doctrines and laws and reservations and so forth, but current generations of Americans now reap the harvest of actions that caused the loss of land, the dishonesty that came from perpetrating these crimes upon our ancestors. Modern Americans live on lands we acknowledge. Native people won't get them back, ever. How can we work together to see what kind of future we can create for the next generation of Americans? We are not trying to revise history. We are trying to correct it. We are trying to make sure that the history of our next generations are learning isn't what the conquerors have or are writing, because it is a history which is written Native American people out at each chapter. Here together on this earth that we all share, let's remember, we are the ones who are living now, and we all are in this together. Let us learn to live in right relationship with this land and with each other. I'd like to close this portion of the presentation on the Doctrine of Discovery with the words of the Yokuts people in California and what they say in their closing prayers. Since many people might not have heard of the Yokuts people, I included the map of California to show you their ancestral territory. At the close of their prayers, they say, "My words are tied in one with the great mountains, with the great rocks, with the great trees. My words are tied in one with my body and my heart. All of you see me, one with this world." The second part of the presentation this evening includes the Land Acknowledgement that I spoke, and also which is becoming more and more a part of what Christian churches are becoming involved with. Acknowledging the indigenous inhabitants of the land which we stand upon is an ancient tradition that has evolved and now the church has adopted. Indigenous people would ask permission to enter lands of another tribe. The coastal tribes of the Pacific Northwest would sail their canoes to the shores of neighboring tribes, stop offshore, and their leaders would stand in the canoe explaining why they were there and requesting permission to land in that territory. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, I was not accustomed to these kinds of traditions of either acknowledging the land's original inhabitants or seeking permission from local tribes for meeting upon their lands until I came to the Pacific Northwest. Within the Presbyterian Church, Native American groups have acknowledged the local tribes for many years. In recommendation from the report on the Doctrine of Discovery in 2018, our General Assembly adopted the Land Acknowledgement practice at all of our meetings and the meetings that they conduct in their committees conducted across the country. Also urging Presbyterian synods and congregations to do the same. Wherever we are on Indigenous land. Anytime we come together for a formal gathering, we have the opportunity to open with respect by acknowledging the land and Indigenous peoples who have tended to that land for many generations, who have lived before settlers have arrived. Where do they live now? What treaties were made and broken? We have felt the energy in the room change with the collective recognition of the history of brokenness that society inherited. Honesty can be a relief, and it can help us to move forward towards wholeness. But land acknowledgements do not absolve modern Americans from the responsibility to seek justice. In fact, strong warnings have been given by Indigenous leaders who speak about land acknowledgements that they shouldn't be seen as ways of repairing or mending the injustice committed against Native peoples. Acknowledging land can be an opening, a reorientation, a way to relate differently to the land and begin to relate differently to the people who have belonged to and took care of the land for thousands of years. It can be a way of reconciliation, new beginnings with Native peoples of the land, whether they are descendants of those first inhabited there or not. Those meaningful land acknowledgements include a commitment to move towards right relationship with Indigenous peoples. Acknowledging the legacies of pain can help guide us toward the messy sacred work of repair, but in themselves, they are not repair. As we connect with this process of acknowledging land, you are encouraged to be open to relating to the land where you live in a new way. This could include learning about local Indigenous people, their understandings of land and sacred sites, conceptualizing land as who instead of what, and regarding it as a problem requiring a solution, the idea that we can own the land. If we're in relationship with the land, what responsibilities of her might we name in our acknowledgement? How might shifting our relationship with land change the way in which we have a relationship with God? So why is Indigenous land acknowledgement important? We have a quote from Northwestern University as they studied this land acknowledgement. And they said, it is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek the understanding of your place within that history. Land acknowledgement does not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. And then from Mary Lyons of the Leech Band of Chippewa. When we talk about land, Land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they're around us. All you do. So I've prepared this document here because I figured that you might want to keep this particular one for if your church is considering doing such an acknowledgement, that you would have something to keep with you. These are tips for creating Indigenous land acknowledgement statements. And the key components begin with start with self-reflection. Before you start work on your land acknowledgement statement, reflect on the process. Why am I doing this land acknowledgement? If you're hoping to inspire others to take action to support Indigenous communities, you're on the right track. If you're delivering a land acknowledgement out of guilt or because everyone else is doing it, more self-reflection is in order. What is my end goal? What do you hope listeners will do after hearing the acknowledgement? When will I have the largest impact? Think about your timing and your audience specifically. Do your homework. Put in the time necessary to research the following topics: the Indigenous people to whom or for whom the land was and is home, the history of the land and any related treaties, tribal names of living Indigenous people from these communities. If you're present on behalf of your work in a certain field, highlight Indigenous people who currently work in that field, Indigenous place names and language, correct pronunciation of the names of the tribes, places, and individuals being used. Use appropriate language. Don't sugarcoat the past. Use terms like genocide, ethnic cleansing, stolen land, and forced removal to reflect actions of colonizers. Use past, present, and future tenses. Indigenous people are still here and they're thriving. Don't treat them as a relic of the past. Land acknowledgements shouldn't be grim. They should function as living celebrations of Indigenous communities. They should also ask yourself, how am I leaving Indigenous people in a stronger, more empowered place because of this land acknowledgement? Focus on the positivity of who Indigenous people are today, whether they still reside on that land or not. Additional factors that you should consider include: don't ask an Indigenous person to deliver a welcome statement for your organization. Build real, authentic relationships with Indigenous people. In addition to normal employment and family obligations, Indigenous people are working to heal their traumas, learn their languages, and support their nation. If you reach out for help, lead the conversation by asking an Indigenous person what you can do for them. Chances are they're likely overworked and can use your help. Compensate Indigenous people for their emotional labor. If you do plan to reach out to an Indigenous person or a community for help, compensate them fairly. Too often, Indigenous people are asked to perform emotional labor for free. Understand displacement and how that plays into land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is complicated. Remember that the United States government displaced many tribes from land before treaties were signed. There are many types of land acknowledgements. Don't expect to find a specific formula or template. Land acknowledgements that come from Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people look different too. Take action. Land acknowledgement alone is not enough. It's merely a starting point. Ask yourself, how do I plan to take action to support Indigenous communities? Examples of ways to take action include: support Indigenous organizations by donating your time and/or money. Support Indigenous-led grassroots change movements and campaigns. Encourage others to do so. Commit to returning land. local, state, and federal governments around the world are currently returning lands to Indigenous peoples. Individuals are returning their land too. Research options to return land. At the end of the day, remember, starting somewhere is better than not trying at all. We need to share the discomfort of Indigenous peoples. They've been uncomfortable for a long time. Dr. Kate Bean, Flandreau, Santee, Dakota, and Muskogee Creek says, we have to try. Starting out with good intentions and a good heart is what matters most. And the resources for this the preceding work here is listed there on your handout as well, with the websites as well. And finally, here's an example. This is from the Seattle Mennonite Church. This congregation created 3 statements to use during gatherings, plus a mural on the side of their building pictured below. Note how they do not place the Duwamish in the past, but instead recognize their continuing presence and claims for unceded lands. The Duwamish people are the people that Chief Seattle came from. We gather on unceded lands of the Duwamish tribe, our neighbors, who have still not received recognition or compensation for land taken from them, though they will continue to fight for their treaties to be acknowledged. The holy ground we gather on this morning is sacred to our Creator and is the original land of our Duwamish kin. It is the unceded ancestral land of our neighbors and friends with whom we seek to be in repaired relationship. We are all newcomers on this land, the unceded land of the Duwamish, a tribe still living and thriving in this city. Neighbors with whom we seek in small and faltering ways to be in repaired relationship. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Ferguson. I'm a member of Tacoma Friends Meeting and as well as Peace Lutheran Church. And we're moving now into the discussion portion of our gathering this evening. And I am putting into chat right now a set of questions. You received these questions among the documents that we sent out earlier today. And you probably haven't had time to mull them over, but you're going to have some time now. They're in chat. And then if you have some of those documents earlier sent handy, you can refer to those as well. When I give the sign to Sandy, she's going to move us into groups of 6 or 7. And you'll have about 20 minutes to explore these questions among yourselves. And you have a goal. And that is at the end of your time, when you come out of the discussion groups and back into plenary, we ask that you bring a question with you. And then we'll ask each group in turn to present that question to Reverend Porter. And we'll go from there. When you move into your groups, we recommend that you find right away a facilitator and a recorder, someone who can make sure that everyone participates, and someone who will record that question that rises from your conversation. And it might be a modification of one of these 5 questions, or it might be something that comes from another direction, a point that wasn't fully elaborated on to your satisfaction. So I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, I'll be around to help you with your groups. But Sandy, would you care to move us into our breakout groups now?
Yes, absolutely. All right, hold on.
Okay, very good. We seem to be stable at around
I think that's it.
50 some, so maybe it's safe to proceed. So I'm going to ask if the representative for group number one would care to unmute and share your question for Irvin Porter.
Sure. So one of the questions that we were wondering about, so we talked about the concept of reparations as it's been introduced for descendants of slaves in the US and trying to make up for some of the racial inequities that happened in the past. So we were wondering, is that something that would be reasonable or appropriate to pursue in a relationship with Native Americans, and what would that look like, or how would we be able to go about that, like supporting something that would help accomplish that? You're still muted.
Okay. You may or may not remember that in the late 70s, early 80s, for instance, the Sioux were successful in the Supreme Court challenge that the land taken from them in the Black Hills was illegally taken, and they won that suit. It took many years for them to prosecute it, and it took the Supreme Court to settle it. And so in the end, the land was, it was determined that the land was improperly taken from the Sioux. And so they were offered some odd millions of dollars. I want to say around 80 million at the time. And the tribes refused to take it. It's not money that Native people want. It's that land. That is the most important thing to Native people. Land is home base. And then your languages and your cultures are part of who you are. So offering a bunch of money to Native American people is not the way. There's been other tribes who have been offered lands back as well. An example here in Tacoma is where the Tacoma Dome now sits was a Puyallup tribal village. And the land was illegally taken from them. It was not purchased. And this went to court as well in the late 70s, early 80s. And they also went to the Supreme Court with it. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor that the land that the Tacoma Dome is on right now belongs to the Puyallup people. But they were not about to tear down a Tacoma Dome, which was new at that point, and the property around it. And so what the state agreed to do and the tribe was that they would take some monies for it, but that they would also be allowed to purchase land outside of their reservation boundary, and it could be placed into trust at any time they so choose to do it. And that land then would be purchased from private owners. In about 2004, 2005, the Puyallup tribe decided that they were going to build a casino, the second casino, their second, in Fife, Washington, right next to I-5. And so the merchants of that area decided that this was unfair, and whatever reason, they didn't want it to happen. Not in our backyard, in other words. And so they took it to court. And what happened was that the Washington Supreme Court heard from both sides, and it was televised. And that went on and on. Merchants got up and talked left and right and all that. And the tribal attorney got up there when it was time for them to give their side of it, and said, I refer you to this agreement from the Supreme Court, the state of Washington, that we would be able to purchase in lieu of taking the land where the Tacoma Dome now sits and some monies, we would be able to purchase land outside of the tribal reservation at any time, as long as we could fully pay for it. and they fully paid for that land. And so that was the end of the suit, because that was already in law from the Supreme Court and from the state court. And so the merchants lost. And so now there is a casino there and a large hotel with a huge parking complex there as well. And it is also now in trust. It is trust property land, which means that there's no taxation on any of that property. So that's what I'm saying, is that to Native American people, the land is the most important thing. They're not interested in money. Money fades, money corrupts, and they don't want that kind of this. What can you eat it down the road? Can you eat that money? No, you can't. It's gone. And so they don't want any part of that. And so reparations is just not something Native people are talking about. They want that land back. And fortunately, there are Christian groups and others who are giving that land back to them and realizing that it was taken involuntarily from them.
I guess I'd wonder, so I've finished following up, if reparations might mean something like that, then trying to actively give land back, is that something that would be reasonable, appropriate to, because I know I use the word reparations, but it doesn't have to be money. I'm just wondering more like righting past wrongs, not necessarily paying people out.
Absolutely. That would be, and that relationship as well. Native people are seen as the boogeyman. Oh, they're coming, they're gonna undercut our, because they don't pay taxes, and all this untruth is out there about Native American tribes, and that everybody has a casino and all these things, and that's just not true. There are many tribes that have no casinos and who are living in deep poverty. There are tribes who have casinos and are doing quite well. And there are other tribes who are robbing Paul to pay Peter because they don't know how to operate and use that much money at one time. So it's across the board. I mean, everybody's got problems. It's just not, but a lot of it is just not, a lot of it is not true. That's out there about Native tribes.
Jackie, did that answer your question fully?
Yes.
Okay, then let's move on to group two. Who speaks for group two?
I think we were group two, unless somebody else thinks they were group two. Hey, Irv, it's great to see you. Thanks for your presentation. Heidi Armstrong here. And just really, you are such a treasure for the Presbyterian Church and the larger church throughout the world. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We were pondering some questions for you. We were kind of thinking, you know, something like what's next, or what's my next step, and hoping you could answer that for us. But I think we'll go with another one, because those don't feel quite like something you can put your arms around. Building relationship. You talked about building relationship, right? And that's pretty key to this work. And I guess I'm wondering where or how or when have you seen that happen? Can you give us a really concrete example of relationship building that really, I don't know, worked or it was real and helpful?
The first thing that comes to my mind is the relationship that one of our presbyteries in Arizona, Grand Canyon Presbytery, has with the over 26 or so congregations in Arizona that are Native American Presbyterian. There was, when I first started to visit with folks from those churches in that area, way before I ever got into the ministry or ever started working for the national church, and I would ask them how their churches are doing and that kind of thing. And every time that they would talk about it, there was always this phenomenon that I heard from them that, well, the presbytery said this and they're going to do that. And there was just this paternal relationship that they had, which they were fine with. And I said, but don't you don't you go to those meetings of the Presbyterian committees and tell them what you need, and that maybe you don't agree with something? Oh no, we don't ever do that. And so was again that paternalistic attitude that it kind of reminds me of the elephant with the chain. You can have the elephant chained up for all its life, but when you take the chain off, it won't go anywhere. Why? Because it's been trained that that's what it does, and that's where it's going to stay. And it reminded me a lot of that analogy. It's changed though. It has changed over the last 20 years. And it has a lot to do with leadership, I believe, in that presbytery, because where the paternalism used to be very, very much a part of how they treated those churches, and it was top down. We'll tell you because you don't know, and they don't trust the sessions of those churches to make their own decisions and all these things. And so it's very much changed now. And with the assessments being done on the church properties around the country, the bill came to $5.2 million. If they fixed all those churches tomorrow, it would cost the denomination $5.2 million to do that for all 97 congregations. And so what has to happen is, as we know, as we Presbyterians know, that money's not coming from the top. It's coming from presbyteries and synods. And so Grand Canyon, to its credit, stepped up first, and they have done many, many things with those congregations down there to help them rebuild their churches, to provide air conditioning in some of those churches in hot Arizona, and to do other things to try to help them to stop worshiping in these places that really should have been condemned, instead of it's the only place they have to worship. So the Grand Canyon Presbytery comes to my mind as having really stepped out and reached out. And then I go to the Synod of the Southwest, which Grand Canyon is part of. They got busy early on in COVID providing meal boxes, providing medical supplies to the reservations, not just because Presbyterians were there, but because the tribes were in need. The biggest need was the Navajo Nation. And so they were on the phone with me. And long story short, they were able to get over $250,000 from the denomination to help. And they were able to get grocery outlets in the Arizona area to offer and donate trucks, refrigerated trucks to take the food and foodstuffs to the Navajo reservation to have them distributed there. So there's many, many things that have been done that I've seen like that. Great successes that tribes and local, either church, tribal areas, or even just private citizens who've taken it upon themselves. At one point, we had one pastor who was handling the influx of donations from people across this country, and she couldn't do it anymore. She was so overwhelmed. But there are places that have already reached out and that relationship, but also not in a one-way thing. It's always been that trust relationship, a two-way street. Remember the days of the missionary barrels? That was the days back in our grandparents' day and earlier, where they would have a barrel in a church and all your old clothes went into it. And then when it got full, they'd ship it off to an Indian reservation. Not clean, not pressed, they just close it up and send it off. And the Indians had to go through it, see what was there, launder the stuff. They called them missionary barrels. And other things, old VBS and Sunday school materials from 10 years ago, they'd ship them off to the Indian reservation. Oh, we're cleaning out our storage unit here in the church, so let's send them off to the Indian. Those days should not continue to happen if they do. It's great need in those churches, and you need to find out what they are. The one-on-ones are best. That's what I do a lot of. I receive a lot of calls from organizations, albeit mostly Presbyterian, to ask about how can we help a particular congregation. We live in California, or we live in Oregon, or we live in Idaho. And then I can get them connected with leaders from those congregations and put them together, and they can work the balance of the relationship out. But if you send a letter to a church and they don't know you, guess where it's going to go? If it even gets open. So it really is important that some relationships are already established and worked out. And that's what I can do, and other people in the denomination, presbyteries and synods can also do to help introduce you, get you involved with other groups, with Native groups.
Thanks, Irv.
Good to see you.
You're muted, Chris.
I was so determined that wasn't going to happen to me this evening.
I know.
We're beginning to run a little short on time, and we want to honor everyone's investment of a couple of hours in this evening. Those groups that would care to are welcome to put their question into the chat, and we can mail those out later. But let's move on to group 3 right now and see what your question might be for Irvin Porter. Who speaks for group 3?
I think that I was in group 3. I'm not totally sure. My name is Wendy. Thank you, Irvin, for your time, and it was wonderful to hear from you. I guess we talked a lot about how churches can give their land back to tribes, and I guess I'm wondering, have you heard of any good success stories in that arena? And does that work well? I have a lot of questions about it, because a lot of churches are in urban areas. It's like a big parking lot with a building. Is that something that is helpful to a tribe if that's given to a tribe? And is it something they want? I've heard that sometimes a tribe might say, well, we don't like the idea of land ownership, and so that's not something we're interested in. I don't know. That's a lot of different questions, but if there's something that you want to address, I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, that certainly surprises me that a tribe would say something about not wanting to own any land after what I've already said. Having said that, yes, I have learned of many instances where not just churches, but organizations have returned land to the indigenous peoples of those properties. The Nespers Tribe in Idaho was given land was given back to them 3 times. The first time was a small strip of land in their indigenous area in Northeast Oregon. And it was the first time since 1877, and a war that erupted from that with the Nespers people and the US government, that the Nespers possessed property in that part of the country. Later on, a larger piece of land from a group was returned to the Nespers Tribe. It used to be a camp, United Methodist camp, but it was no longer being used. There was very few people that were coming there. They were running low on funding to keep it going. And so it was decided to return that land to the Nespers Tribe. So they call it the ranch now, that the Nespers people own. And then about 2 years ago, the United Methodist Church in Joseph, Oregon, I believe it was, returned a church property. It was included a large church built out of rock in the downtown area of that town, which included, I want to say about 2 acres of land that the church sat upon. Now, certainly the tribe is not going to open its own church or do something like that with it. But however, certainly the property could be, the land, the buildings could be raised, and the property could be used otherwise. But From what I understand, they're trying to figure out, should they keep the building, the sound building, and use it for tribal purposes and all that kind of thing. So yes, there have been instances that those examples of where tribes have returned, land has been returned, church properties have been returned to Native tribes around the country. And it's not just organizations or churches or whatever. Individuals have done this as well. There was an instance of a man in Wyoming who inherited a large plot of ranch land that his ancestors ranched and did whatever cattle on for many generations. But as the family evolved, a lot of them moved to the cities, and he did, and he was the then heir of that property. He had no children. He wasn't married. Was in his late 60s. And so he decided that there was no way he was going to ranch on that land. And then he decided that he wanted to know who were the indigenous inhabitants of that land. He found out who they were, and he gave them over 1,000 acres of land. And so it's happened. There are other examples of that I could go on all night about. However, those kinds of actions certainly don't come easily. They come with controversy. They come with a lot of baggage, as it were. But it has happened. It's happening even more so anymore. And so I know that there are 3 congregations within the Presbyterian Church right now who have been in discussion with me. Most of them are in the east of this country, and they're preparing to return property to the indigenous people of those particular areas. And especially in the east, where there's very little native land, reservation land. It's very important. We used to have a conference center at Stony Point, New York. And that property at that church there in that town, that village, was returned to the Native American tribe. And after 10 years, they will get full deed to it. There's a string attached in that they needed to do X, Y, and Z because they're going to build a community center, and they're going to have various programs coming out of that place. And in 10 years, if that's the case and they've done all those things, then the property will revert to them completely. So it has happened, and it is happening. And I'm glad that a lot of that inquiry is coming to my office, and so I deal with that a lot.
One more, I'm just gonna ask a quick question.
Wendy, if you don't mind, we probably ought to move on to another
okay.
group. Is
Okay.
that okay?
Maybe I'll email you later.
You can put it into the chat. We're collecting chat questions.
Okay,
We're going to ask Reverend Porter to respond to them in writing, and we'll mail them out.
thank you, Reverend Porter.
So if, as we go through the groups, if some of the higher number groups want to put their question into chat, when we get to you, just say it's in chat, and we'll handle it in writing. Okay. Let's try group 4. Who's going to speak for group 4?
I guess that's me. This is Verna from Tacoma Friends Meeting. We noted that white school children were indoctrinated with the Doctrine of Discovery too. We had tests on that, someone said. Then we considered how the Bible verse commanding people to go into all nations and make disciples was used as a justification for the Doctrine of Discovery. And then we compared that with another Bible verse that says they'll know you're Christians by your love, and contrasted that and how we want to use that to reconcile now. So we talked about reconciliation with love. One person said we need to speak the truth from love and not from self-righteousness. And then one person ended us on a question. They said, so how do we talk to people who are resistant to reconciliation? How do we talk to people that don't buy into this with love and not with conflict? So that's where we ended.
That's a good dilemma. While it seems difficult, it's speaking to one another. It's speaking to the issues that are at the heart of all of this. I have actually, during the late October, I prepared a presentation on the decolonizing the Thanksgiving myth. And it was for a church in Connecticut. And right in their backyard is where all that happened. And so it was decolonizing what children have been taught, what we have all been taught over the years about those things that we give little heed to, about what really happened with those people. What are they still there? Do they still exist? Yes, they do. In fact, the Wampanoag people who met with the Pilgrims just barely received national tribal recognition about 3 years ago, over 200 years. And they finally have become a recognized federally recognized tribe on their own lands. So there's a lot of myths out there that have been spread for whatever reason. We can talk about that all day. But trying to find out where that came from and to untangle it, as it were, is a difficult thing to do. And it's a hurtful thing to do, because it belies all those things you've been told and taught and put into memory and then taught your own children and all those things. It's not easy when you go against the grain in this country, and Native people know that. We've known that for 500 years. Every time we tried to speak that truth and love kind of thing that you mentioned, Native people were put down and told to none of your concern. We don't want to hear about it or anything like that. Now it is of top concern. And what it really has taken is that it's taken non-Native people to ally with Native American people to tell this country that no, it's time to listen to this. It's time, the time has come. Now, a lot of this that I'm talking about, the Doctrine of Discovery, I showed you the list in my presentation of what our General Assembly has done since 2016. It has all happened prior, just on the cusp of what is going on in our country right now. And a lot of people are calling it whatever moniker they're trying to give that in our schools or whatever. And Native American people have been talking about these issues for hundreds of years. So we're not new to this discussion, but many people want to color us as trying to be politically correct about all these things and all that. But if they look at the record, they find out that Native people have been talking about these things for a long, long time. And so it's not new. These are not new issues to us. It certainly has become new to my office since the General Assembly has picked this up in 2016. This kind of work, these presentations that I do now are clearly a quarter of what I do. I usually give about 2 or 3 presentations per month. And so this one is one for this month, and in February, I've got 2 lined up as well. So it's just a large part of spreading what the information is for people to listen to that and discover and understand, to try to, and that's why we like to give the resources so that people can understand more about these issues. It's kind of like preaching. I'm going to tell you what the Word of God says to Irvin Porter, as I've read and studied God's Word and listened to the Spirit and all that. But it's up to you as a person sitting in the pew to find out, is he telling the truth? Is that really what it means? Because that's what it's about. It's making sure that you go and find out and research and do the spade work that's necessary to find out what happened and what's going on. And be careful about also what kind of things you're reading and who you're reading from, because it's true that the history is written from the view of the conqueror. And I'm finding that out more and more as I research things. And so Native American scholarship on these issues is thankfully becoming more and more widespread in the country than it even was 20 years ago. But we have a long way to go still. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. I have colleagues that have helped me make presentations to our national church on these topics. One of them's a lawyer from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. And the other one happens to be our co-moderator of our General Assembly, Ilona Street Stewart, who is Delaware and lives in the Minneapolis area. Great scholars, Native Americans, they can talk circles around what I know. But we're out there doing the work as much as we can, trying to help people understand and to do presentations like this and listen and answer some of your questions. And hopefully you can get more information and start to look as well for yourselves. That's why those documents that I've given for a resource are there. They've been researched, they've been looked at, and they are Native approved, as it were.
Friends and colleagues, I regret to say that we've gone well beyond our promised closing time. If you have any more questions from groups or individually, put them into the chat now, and we'll try to address them by email and send them out to everyone sometime in the near future. At this point now, we're going to go back to our introducer, Matt Robbins Gormley, who is going to close us out.
What an evening together. Thank you so much, Irvin, for all the time and energy you put into this presentation, and you have given all of us lots to ponder and think about, and thank you too for the resources you passed along. I hope all of us can have a little bit more extended time to learn and grow from those. One just final note, a reminder that we're going to be doing this again with a real focus on the boarding school period that Irvin talked a little bit about tonight. That will be on the 22nd of February, 6:30, right here like this on Zoom. It will be, just so you know, if you registered for this, which I think most everybody who's here has, you don't need to re-register, but you can also encourage friends and others who might be of interest to register using the same link that we put out in the information before. And really would love to see us back so we can continue our learning together. And just know that those resources too are great to pass on to colleagues and leaders in your circles, in your faith community, and really want to extend kind of what has happened here this evening into the places where you are as well. So thanks again to Irvin, and thanks to Associated Ministries and our Conversations Around Race crew, and we'll look forward to seeing you back again next month. So thanks again very much, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Unmuted. If you want to shout out a goodbye.
60s that went in.
Chris, there was one or two people, I think I was in room 5, that had to go.
Ah, okay.
So